It was the winter of 1944 when the long trains rolled across the frozen plains of Wisconsin, their windows sealed, the carriages marked with military insignia and guarded by armed soldiers who spoke little to those inside. The men being transported were no longer soldiers of the Emperor, but prisoners, captured in the jungles of the Pacific, the beaches of Saipan, and the scattered atolls of a collapsing empire. They had been taught to expect nothing but cruelty. In their minds, captivity was not survival but dishonor, and death had seemed the more logical path. Yet when the heavy doors opened at Camp McCoy, the first thing that greeted them was not a rifle barrel, but a wave of warm air smelling faintly of bread, meat, and something strange, something sweet. The guards spoke calmly, using gestures more than words, guiding the exhausted men toward barracks that were heated and orderly. It was snowing outside, and many of the prisoners, having never seen snow, stared in disbelief at the white landscape. They were given wool blankets, clean clothes, and a meal ticket marked with their numbers. None of it made sense. In the culture they came from, an enemy who showed mercy was a contradiction. A few whispered that it must be a trick, a final humiliation before execution. Inside the mess hall, metal trays clattered as soldiers, American and Japanese alike, formed two silent lines. The air was heavy with the smell of fried potatoes and something sizzling on a griddle. When the first group of prisoners received their food, they froze. On their trays sat thick round patties of meat between soft pieces of bread, golden strips of potatoes, and a dark, bubbling drink poured from a glass bottle. They did not recognize it as a hamburger or Coca-Cola, to them it was simply alien. Some stared in suspicion, others in hunger. A few took cautious bites, and in that moment the room filled with something no one expected, laughter. Nervous, disbelieving laughter. One man began to cry quietly as he chewed, the taste flooding his senses in ways he could not describe. For months they had eaten little more than rice water and seaweed, surviving on discipline and belief. Now, in the hands of their captors, they tasted abundance, and it shattered something deep within them. American guards watched silently, some smiling, others uncertain. They too had been told who their enemies were, fanatical, ruthless, unfeeling. Yet what they saw before them were men, thin, tired, and suddenly human. Over the next days, word spread through the camp that these devils treated prisoners with dignity. They were given work assignments, fair rations, even access to books and newspapers translated by Nisei interpreters. For those who had expected starvation and beatings, it was impossible to reconcile. Among the Americans, there was no grand humanitarian plan at work. The treatment of prisoners was simply policy, set by the Geneva Convention and enforced with typical American bureaucracy. But for the Japanese, raised in a military culture where surrender was the ultimate disgrace, this civility struck at the very core of their worldview. In Tokyo, propaganda painted American captivity as torture. In Wisconsin, the reality was a cafeteria line serving hamburgers. Historian accounts later described these early encounters as moments of profound psychological rupture. Some prisoners wrote in secret diaries, confessing their confusion. If this is the enemy, what is the meaning of what we were told? Inside Camp McCoy, daily life took on rhythms of quiet coexistence. Prisoners worked in local lumber mills, repaired farm equipment, and learned English from volunteer teachers. They were paid in tokens redeemable for small luxuries, soap, cigarettes, writing paper. When guards distributed bottles of Coca-Cola, the fizzy sweetness stunned them. For many, it was the first taste of something purely unnecessary, something made for pleasure rather than survival. That idea, more than anything, disoriented them. In a world at war, indulgence had become a foreign concept. One evening, after lights out, a group of prisoners whispered about the meal they had eaten. They debated whether such generosity could be real or if it was meant to weaken them. An older soldier, once a schoolteacher in Osaka, said quietly, "Perhaps the Americans feed us not because they are kind, but because they can." The others fell silent, the truth of that statement settling over them like the cold Wisconsin night. It was not kindness alone that shocked them, it was the scale of power that could afford to be kind. Over the next weeks, some of the men began to write letters home through Red Cross channels. They spoke not of humiliation but of bewilderment, of how their enemy's strength came not only from weapons but from abundance. American officers overseeing the camp noted the change. Discipline improved. Escape attempts were rare. There was even laughter heard in the barracks during free time. Yet beneath it all, a quiet melancholy remained. Each meal reminded them of how far Japan had fallen behind, how their families suffered while they ate meat and drank soda. Psychologists later described this as a form of moral inversion, where mercy wounds deeper than punishment because it exposes the lie of hatred. In that dining hall, as steam rose from hundreds of plates, a kind of cultural dissonance unfolded that no weapon could create. Years later, when these men returned home, many would speak of that first meal as the moment the war ended in their hearts. They had expected violence. Instead, they found humanity, and it broke them. The story of those days survives in letters, photographs, and faded memories, a small chapter of the vast machinery of war that reveals something profoundly simple: sometimes, compassion is more disarming than force. In the end, it was not ideology or strategy that humbled these soldiers, but a hamburger and a bottle of Coca-Cola. And for every man who tasted them, the sweetness was inseparable from the sorrow it carried. What they could not know then was that their experience would become a symbol of post-war reconciliation, a quiet testament to the strange ways humanity survives even amid its darkest acts. This is just the beginning of their story, a story not of victors and vanquished, but of men rediscovering what it means to be human. Stay with us as we journey deeper into the forgotten world of prisoner camps, compassion, and contradiction. And if you want to continue exploring these powerful untold histories, don't forget to subscribe for more. As the weeks turned into months, life inside Camp McCoy began to follow a rhythm that few of the prisoners could have imagined possible. Each morning, a whistle sounded over the snow-covered fields, and men filed out of their barracks in orderly lines, their breath steaming in the cold air. They were assigned tasks: cutting timber, repairing fences, or working in nearby farms, and always returned before sunset to the warmth of their bunks and the smell of food cooking in the mess hall. The Americans who guarded them rarely raised their voices. For men who had been trained to believe that captivity stripped them of honor, the discipline of everyday kindness was confusing. Some resisted it, keeping to themselves and refusing to learn the language of their captors. But others began to soften, to see in these routines something that felt strangely like peace. One such man was Private Hiroshi Takeda, a fisherman's son from Shikoku who had been captured on Saipan. He was 23, quiet, and cautious. The first time he tasted Coca-Cola, he had spat it out in surprise, then laughed until he cried. Now, months later, he kept the empty bottle hidden under his mattress, polishing it with a rag each evening as if it were a relic from another world. For him, it symbolized a kind of awakening, the realization that his understanding of the enemy had been wrong from the beginning. He began to talk with one of the guards, a young American named Corporal James Harper, who came from a dairy farm outside Madison. They spoke through broken words and gestures, slowly building a fragile bridge across language and ideology. Harper once shared with him a small photograph of his family, smiling in front of a red barn. Hiroshi stared at it for a long time and then, without saying a word, took from his pocket a crumpled photograph of his own family standing by the sea. The two men laughed quietly at the similarity: two worlds divided by war, united by something as simple as a family picture. The war outside continued to rage. News of the Pacific battles filtered into the camp through American newspapers, and though the prisoners could not read English fluently, they sensed the shifting tide. Japan was retreating, city after city falling under firebombs. Some of the men grew withdrawn, haunted by guilt for surviving when their comrades had not. Yet even in those dark reflections, the absurd normalcy of life in an American camp pressed upon them. They played baseball with handmade bats, listened to music from a radio that Harper sometimes brought to the barracks, and watched as farmers' children waved to them through the wire fence. The contradictions multiplied daily. How could the enemy's heart contain such generosity? When a Wisconsin farmer invited a work detail to share a meal in his barn, one prisoner broke down completely, unable to eat. He later told the camp interpreter, "I cannot understand this kindness. It hurts." American guards, too, were changing. Some entered the job believing in the wartime propaganda that portrayed Japanese soldiers as fanatics incapable of emotion. But after months of shared routine, they realized the enemy was not a monster, but a mirror, ordinary men drawn into extraordinary circumstances. In letters home, several guards described the prisoners as respectful, hardworking, and surprisingly polite. One even wrote, "Sometimes I forget they're prisoners. It feels more like we're just waiting out the war together." That quiet humanity, unnoticed by the world beyond the fences, was perhaps the most subversive act of all. The camp commandant, Colonel Donald C. Gilbert, enforced the Geneva Convention strictly not out of sympathy, but conviction. "If we treat them with honor," he once told a visiting officer, "we prove our system is stronger than theirs." To him, morality was not weakness, it was strategy. Yet in practice, that strategy created something much deeper, reconciliation in its earliest form. Each small act, a cigarette shared, a photograph exchanged, a baseball game played under the summer sun, eroded the invisible walls built by years of propaganda. When winter returned in early 1945, many of the prisoners volunteered for extra duties shoveling snow, mending roofs, anything to occupy their minds. They had become part of the quiet machinery of the American home front, invisible to most citizens. Some locals, seeing the Japanese laboring in nearby fields, felt uneasy at first, but the fear soon gave way to curiosity. Newspaper reporters occasionally visited, writing short features about the polite prisoners who work without complaint. In one such article, a journalist noted that the men smiled shyly when offered hot coffee and seemed bewildered by kindness. That bewilderment would stay with them long after they returned home. In late March, Hiroshi Takeda was assigned to help repair a tractor engine in a nearby village workshop. The American mechanic handed him a wrench, and together they worked in silence until the engine roared to life. The mechanic, a heavy-set man with oil-stained hands, patted Hiroshi on the shoulder and said something he didn't understand, but the tone said everything. For the first time since his capture, Hiroshi felt useful again, like a man instead of a ghost. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "Today I remembered I have hands." Across the camp, similar awakenings occurred. Some prisoners began to hum American tunes, others asked for English dictionaries. The camp's chaplain even organized small lectures on democracy and post-war reconstruction, which a few prisoners attended out of curiosity. It was not indoctrination, it was exposure, a window into a world where freedom was not just an idea, but a structure. As spring arrived, the snow melted, revealing patches of green across the compound. New shipments of supplies brought more of the now familiar foods, canned fruit, coffee, and, to everyone's delight, more Coca-Cola. The bottles clinked together as they were handed out, a sound that seemed to mark a new rhythm in the camp's life. One prisoner joked that America's true weapon was not the atomic bomb but the hamburger, and the others laughed with him. Beneath that laughter was something profound, the slow collapse of hatred, replaced not by love but by understanding. What began as disbelief was becoming introspection. For men raised to die for the emperor, the discovery that an enemy could live for comfort and kindness was revolutionary. It rewrote their concept of strength. And as the guards and prisoners continued their strange coexistence, neither realized that history would one day look back on this experiment in humanity as one of the quiet triumphs of the war. By the summer of 1945, Camp McCoy had transformed into a strange reflection of peace within a world still at war. The prisoners woke each morning to the sounds of birds and farm machinery rather than air raid sirens or artillery. They worked, studied, and even smiled, tentatively at first, then naturally, as though rediscovering the rhythm of ordinary life. The war outside their fences had become an abstraction, something distant and fading. Yet deep down, every man knew that a reckoning was coming. Rumors drifted through the camp: Germany had surrendered, the Pacific was collapsing, and American planes were striking Japan with terrifying new ferocity. The Japanese prisoners could only imagine what was happening to their homeland, their families, their cities. One afternoon, a Red Cross representative arrived to deliver a list of prisoner names confirmed alive to families in Japan. The men gathered anxiously as the interpreter read each name. Some cheered softly, others wept in relief. But many names were missing, lost to the bureaucratic fog of war. Those who remained unlisted sat silently, staring at the ground, their thoughts drifting thousands of miles across the ocean. It was in that atmosphere of uncertainty that an American chaplain organized a discussion series in the camp's assembly hall. He called it "Life After the War." Attendance was voluntary, but curiosity drew many of the prisoners there. The chaplain spoke slowly, through interpreters, about rebuilding, forgiveness, and the meaning of peace. To men who had been taught that surrender was shame, these words carried the weight of heresy. Yet something in the calmness of his voice, the gentle logic of his reasoning, disarmed them. "Mercy," he said one evening, "is not a weakness of nations. It is the strength that survives when war ends." Those words stayed with them. In their barracks, the prisoners debated quietly, sometimes late into the night, trying to reconcile the world they had imagined with the one they now saw before them. Hiroshi Takeda often listened more than he spoke. He had changed since his arrival, his posture straighter, his eyes clearer. The Coca-Cola bottle he had once hidden under his mattress now sat openly on the shelf above his bed. It had become something like a symbol, not of defeat but of comprehension. He wrote in his journal, "I have seen a country where people are not afraid to laugh." Perhaps we misunderstood what strength truly means. His words echoed a sentiment that spread slowly among the men, that their understanding of the world had been too narrow, too defined by the voices of generals and emperors. In the summer heat, the camp became more relaxed. The guards trusted the prisoners enough to reduce patrols, and sometimes American soldiers played baseball with them on weekends. The sound of laughter and the thud of a ball against a mitt filled the air, blending cultures in a way neither side could have imagined a year earlier. For the locals who occasionally drove past the camp fence, it was a surreal sight, former enemies tossing a ball under the same sun. But inside the wire, those games meant something profound. They were practice for a kind of coexistence the world had not yet learned to master. Then, in early August, everything changed. The first whispers arrived through the American newspapers. Hiroshima had been destroyed by a single bomb. The prisoners crowded around the bulletin board where the guards pinned clippings, staring at the unfamiliar word, atomic. At first, they didn't believe it. How could one bomb do what hundreds had not? But when the second city, Nagasaki, followed, silence descended over the camp. Men sat on their bunks for hours, unable to speak. Some prayed quietly, others stared into space. The war that had defined their existence was ending, but not in any way they could understand. For many, the news triggered a wave of guilt and grief deeper than anything they had felt before. They had feared American cruelty, but never American power. Now they saw that the mercy they had experienced in Wisconsin was not born of weakness but of overwhelming strength, a strength so great it could choose compassion without risk. That realization left them shaken. Colonel Gilbert addressed the camp a few days later. Standing on the assembly platform, he read from a telegram confirming Japan's surrender. The war was over. Some prisoners bowed their heads, others wept openly. The guards stood in silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The sound of wind through the tall grass was the only noise. When the chaplain finally spoke, he said simply, "You will soon go home. May peace travel with you." Over the next weeks, preparations began for repatriation. Uniforms were issued, papers signed, and medical checks conducted. The prisoners, now thinner but healthier than when they arrived, found themselves torn between relief and uncertainty. What kind of home awaited them? Would they be accepted or condemned as cowards? Many feared that their families would see their survival not as fortune but as shame. Yet as they packed their few belongings, they also carried something intangible, an altered understanding of humanity. On their final night at Camp McCoy, the kitchen staff prepared a farewell meal. It was simple: hamburgers, fried potatoes, and bottles of Coca-Cola. When the food was served, no one laughed this time. The men ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that this would be their last taste of America. Hiroshi lifted his bottle and looked at Corporal Harper, who stood near the door. With a small nod, he raised it in silent salute. Harper smiled and returned the gesture. Neither spoke a word, but both understood. Across the mess hall, similar scenes played out: handshakes, quiet bows, a few words of gratitude exchanged through interpreters. For the prisoners, it was a final paradox: their captors had become their teachers. That night, as they lay in their bunks for the last time, some could not sleep. Outside, the Wisconsin summer air was warm, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. A few men stood by the window, staring at the stars. Hiroshi whispered to no one in particular, "Perhaps peace is just another kind of captivity, but one we must learn to live with." When morning came, the camp gates opened. Trucks waited to take them to the train that would begin their long journey home. The guards stood at attention as the men filed past, saluting politely. As each prisoner boarded, the clinking of Coca-Cola bottles echoed once more, this time from the hands of Americans who pressed them through the truck windows as parting gifts. For some, it was a gesture too much to bear, their eyes filled with tears. For others, it was a quiet reminder that mercy, once tasted, never leaves the soul unchanged. The voyage home was long and quiet. Aboard the transport ship that carried them across the Pacific, the former prisoners lined the railings, watching the endless water roll beneath them. Some clutched letters written in English by the American guards, farewell notes folded neatly like talismans. Others simply stared into the horizon, their thoughts heavy with questions they dared not speak aloud. The ship's food was American, simple, plentiful, familiar now to their tongues, and yet it tasted different, touched by melancholy. The Coca-Cola bottles handed to them before departure remained unopened by most, as though they carried too much memory to be consumed. After weeks at sea, the gray outline of Japan finally emerged from the mist. It was not the home they had left. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone, Tokyo lay in ruins, cities smoldered beneath the weight of defeat. The country they had been taught to die for had been humbled beyond recognition. As the men disembarked, the air smelled of ash and sea salt, and silence hung over the docks like fog. American occupation troops directed the arrivals with polite efficiency. To the returning prisoners, it felt like stepping from one world of captivity into another, except this one bore the scars of their nation's collapse. Families gathered at the ports to search for familiar faces. Some reunions were joyful, others were hesitant, marked by confusion and shame. A few men were met with silence, their families turning away in quiet disapproval. In the rigid moral code of wartime Japan, surrender had been a disgrace, a stain that no kindness abroad could erase. But over time, as the realities of survival took precedence, attitudes began to soften. Hiroshi Takeda found his family's home in Nagoya reduced to rubble. His wife and son had survived, living in a temporary shelter near a bombed-out school. When they saw him approach in his patched American-issued clothes, they did not speak for a long moment. Then his wife stepped forward and touched his face, as if to confirm he was real. He told them little about his captivity at first. How could he explain the contradictions? That he had learned mercy in the enemy's hands? That the men he had been told were barbarians had given him warmth, food, and a reason to rethink what strength truly meant? Instead, he began to work, quietly, helping rebuild the small community around him. Like many former prisoners, he took a job under the supervision of American reconstruction teams. There, he recognized familiar words, familiar uniforms, and even familiar kindness. One day, a U.S. engineer noticed his English and asked where he had learned it. Wisconsin, Hiroshi said with a faint smile. The engineer laughed, not understanding the full weight of that answer. Across Japan, similar stories unfolded. Former POWs, once considered tainted, began to play quiet but vital roles in rebuilding the country. They had seen how systems worked in America, how organization, practicality, and efficiency replaced hierarchy and fear. Those lessons, absorbed behind barbed wire, became the invisible foundation of post-war Japanese industry. Historians would later call it a miracle, but for men like Hiroshi, it was simply adaptation born of necessity and memory. At night, he often thought of the camp's chaplain and his words, "Mercy is the strength that survives when war ends." Sometimes, he whispered them aloud to his son as they fell asleep in the dim light of an oil lamp. The boy, too young to understand, would one day repeat them to his own children. In the cities, Coca-Cola appeared again, first in American PX stores, then in small Japanese markets. To most, it was a symbol of occupation, but to a quiet few, it was something more personal. For the former prisoners, each bottle represented a strange, enduring paradox: defeat intertwined with dignity, sweetness mingled with loss. When they saw the red and white label, they remembered the snowy fields of Wisconsin, the laughter of American guards, and the taste that had made them cry. Decades passed. Japan transformed from ruins to a global power. The generation that had fought and surrendered aged into history. By the 1970s, scholars began collecting oral histories from Japanese POWs, trying to capture their memories before they vanished. Many spoke reluctantly at first, fearing judgment. But when they did, a consistent theme emerged, not of cruelty or bitterness, but of astonishment. "They fed us like guests," one said. "They gave us books. They gave us hope. We thought they would kill us, but they gave us hamburgers." Another recalled the moment he first saw Coca-Cola poured into a glass. "It looked like medicine," he laughed softly, "but it healed something inside us." These testimonies, preserved in archives and documentaries, revealed a truth that war itself had concealed, that kindness can wound the proud more deeply than hatred, yet also mend what hatred destroys. Hiroshi's final years were spent quietly. He became a teacher, instructing young students in English and ethics, though few knew the depth of his experience. When asked by one of his pupils what America was really like, he paused for a long time before answering. "It is a country that can build bombs to destroy the world," he said, "and at the same time build a meal that can make a man weep." In 1985, he attended a reunion in Tokyo organized by a small veterans group that included both Japanese and American attendees. Among the items displayed were artifacts from various camps, letters, photographs, even one preserved Coca-Cola bottle with a handwritten note attached, "To the men who learned peace in captivity." The atmosphere was solemn but warm, the weight of the past softened by time. When Hiroshi lifted that bottle and looked through the glass, he could almost see the snowy fields again, hear the laughter. Feel the impossible warmth of a Wisconsin winter. The war had ended 40 years earlier, but in that moment, it felt both near and distant, like a lesson the world still needed to learn. As he left the reunion, an American journalist asked him what he had taken away from his years as a prisoner. He thought for a long moment, then said quietly, "That victory without mercy is only another kind of defeat." The journalist wrote it down, but Hiroshi knew it was not meant for print, it was meant for remembrance. For the men who had lived through those winters, mercy had not been an abstract idea, it had been a taste, a gesture, a simple meal that turned enemies into human beings. In the twilight years of the century, the story of the Japanese prisoners in Wisconsin began to resurface in documentaries, academic journals, and quiet corners of museums. It was not a tale of battles or generals but of kitchens and kindness, of a war that ended not with the flash of bombs but with the taste of food shared between enemies. In one exhibit at a small museum in Tokyo, a photograph showed a group of thin men in American uniforms smiling awkwardly beside their guards, a Coca-Cola crate at their feet. The caption read simply, "Camp McCoy, 1945." Visitors often paused before the image, unsure what to feel. The familiar narrative of victim and victor dissolved under the weight of human complexity. Mercy had not been part of the wartime vocabulary, yet here it stood, documented, undeniable. Historians revisiting the records found that many of the men who passed through American POW camps went on to shape post-war Japan in subtle but profound ways. Some became teachers, engineers, and factory managers who embraced efficiency and collaboration. Others worked in trade and diplomacy, advocating for mutual understanding rather than revenge. The lessons learned behind barbed wire, about practicality, humility, and shared humanity, had rippled outward into a nation's rebirth. In interviews conducted decades later, a few surviving veterans of the U.S. Army recalled their time as guards with equal fondness and disbelief. "They expected us to beat them," one said. "But we just gave them work and food." Maybe that confused them more than any punishment could. Another remembered a Japanese prisoner who fixed his broken watch and refused payment. He said, "We are both men, not soldiers now." I never forgot that. Such small moments became the quiet architecture of reconciliation. As the world entered a new millennium, both nations stood as allies, their industries intertwined, their cultures exchanged freely. The bitterness of war had not vanished, but it had been transformed, refined by time and memory. Yet beneath the surface of history's grand events, individual lives like Hiroshi Takeda's carried the real legacy of understanding. In his final years, Hiroshi wrote a short memoir, never published but passed down through his family. Its pages, yellowed and fragile, told of the journey from Nagoya to Wisconsin and back again. He described the first night in the camp, the fear, the cold, and the smell of unfamiliar food. Then came the meal, the hamburger, the fried potatoes, the Coca-Cola, and the way it dissolved everything he thought he knew about his enemy. That taste, he wrote, was not of defeat. It was of awakening. His granddaughter later said she read that line every year on the anniversary of his death. It reminded her that the world's greatest revolutions are often born not from weapons, but from empathy. In one recorded interview preserved in the U.S. National Archives, a former chaplain from Camp McCoy summarized it best. "We didn't intend to change them. We just treated them like men. But sometimes, when the world is burning, that is revolution enough." And perhaps that was the true meaning of the story, the quiet victory that outlasted all others. In the end, the legacy of those camps was not in the statistics of how many prisoners were fed or released. It lived instead in the invisible bridge built between two nations, a bridge formed from compassion when compassion seemed least possible. The same American hands that had built bombers and battleships also handed out warm meals and bottles of soda to their captives. The same Japanese soldiers who had sworn to die for their emperor found peace through a gesture of humanity they could not have imagined. History, in its vastness, rarely pauses for such moments, yet these are the ones that define civilizations. When the last of those men passed away, their memories lingered in faded letters and family stories, in the strange irony that what broke them was not cruelty but kindness. Across decades and oceans, their experiences remind us of something simple and enduring, that mercy, once offered, does not vanish with time. It becomes inheritance. It becomes culture. It becomes peace. And in that sense, the war never truly ended in fire, it ended in a cafeteria in Wisconsin, with the hiss of a soda bottle and the first bite of a hamburger shared between enemies. For all the world's technological progress, its treaties, and its politics, few lessons are more profound than the one taught there, that understanding, once awakened, cannot be conquered. In the closing frames of this story, the camera might linger on that black and white photograph from 1945, then slowly fade to color. The snow melts. The men laugh. The guards smile. And somewhere, faintly, the sound of glass bottles clinking carries across the years. Because history, at its heart, is not made by nations, it is made by people who choose compassion when they could choose power. And those choices, however small, can change the course of the world. This has been a story of war, humanity, and redemption. If you've traveled with us through this forgotten chapter of history, remember, there are countless more stories like it, waiting to be told. Subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the untold corners of our past, where humanity reveals itself, not in glory or conquest, but in the quiet mercy that survives the ruins of war.